Hello and welcome. You're watching NewsX with me, Devika Devan. The U.S. has imposed a 50% tariff on Indian exports, combining a 25% reciprocal tariff and a 25% penalty for India's $52.7 billion worth of Russian oil purchases. This is aimed at pressuring Russia over the Ukraine war. As per our calculation, this impacts $60.2 billion worth of India's $87 billion U.S. export market, hitting textiles, gems, jewelry and auto parts. It also threatens jobs and India's export-driven growth. Pharmaceuticals and electronics have been exempt, but a potential 200% drug tariff looms large. India calls this move completely unfair, with Prime Minister Modi vowing to protect national interests. Experts warn of a 0.3 to 0.8% drop in GDP growth. While India explores trade talks and closer ties with China to counter the impact, there are several new aspects of geopolitics that continue to emerge on a daily basis as more and more nations turn to each other for greater bilateral relations. Has Donald Trump ushered in a new era in global politics and global trade? We take that conversation forward. I have with me on the broadcast Mr. Andrew K.P. Leung, who will be joining us from Hong Kong. He's an independent China strategist. Also with me, Dr. Satoru Nagao, fellow at the Hudson Institute in Tokyo. Mr. Keith Vass, former Minister of the UK, joins us live as well. And Mr. Ravi Karkara, founder of Invest NYC Forum, joins us from the United States of America. Let me begin with Dr. Satoru Nagao. Dr. Nagao, we are expecting our Prime Minister to be in Japan, the Indian Prime Minister to be in Japan very shortly from now. What really are you hoping will be the tone and tenor of this visit, given that we've just had a huge announcement today where our Prime Minister has flagged off Maruti Suzuki's first electric vehicle, e-Vitara, in India, and Suzuki has also announced a major investment of upwards of rupees 70,000 crores in India in the next 5 to 6 years. My simple point being, what is your expectation from this visit where our Prime Minister will be meeting his Japanese counterpart amid this entire problem of the Trump tariffs?
Trump tariff is not directly linked with Indian-Japan relation, I believe, because rising India and relation with Japan has a huge potential itself. So firstly, we should remember why Shinzo Abe mentioned about Indo-Pacific and Quad, especially in 2007 when he addressed in the Indian Parliament. Title is Conference 2C. That time he introduced it because Indian Ocean has the potential and the Pacific Ocean want to connect with the Indian Ocean, which is we want to cooperate with India. It's a very important message. Because India is rising, geographically India has the potential to expand their influence through sea in the Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. All of the area are surrounded but connected with India. So if India will rise, India's influence will spread to this area, and Japan focusing on this situation. Of course, China is a very important factor and motivation for Japan. But the view from now, it is Shinzo Abe was right, because India's potential itself is quite attractive. That is very important. That is one thing. So when the Prime Minister Modi visit Japan and Japan decide to invest huge in India and making the factory in India, export from India to this region, it will be very strategic. Just some days before his visit, Prime Minister Modi's visit, Japan already published Indian Ocean Africa Economic Zone Initiative. This is a huge potential in the Indian Ocean because this is focusing on African policy. India and Japan collaborate each other in Africa. Middle East, IMEC, in G20, India published this idea. India, Middle East, and Europe. So India, Middle East, Europe, India, Middle East, Africa, which is Indian Ocean, Africa's Economic Zone Initiative, I want to say. So all of these regions related with the India-Japan relations. So that's why this is very important. But at the same time, if you think about relation with Trump, so I need to say one thing, another thing in this case. When Trump tried to deal, he used intimidation. But contents of the intimidation is not so important. If he tried to deal with Zelensky, what happened? He said Zelensky was dictator or something. Next day, the journalist asked President Trump, after he have already talked with Zelensky, he said, did I say that? I did not think so. So content is not the matter. When Japan deal with the United States, President Trump said, Japan must import rice. But under the negotiation between US and Japan, there is no mention about rice. Just increase a little, but very little. So that's not a big matter. So when Trump intimidate other country to deal, content is not big. The content is not so important. That is what I want to say, view from the Japanese experiences. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, all right. I want to bring in Mr. Ravi Kakara into the conversation as well. Mr. Kakara, I want to understand from your perspective, you're joining us from the US, where most of this action is taking place on a daily basis. How exactly are the consumers in the United States of America reacting to the tariffs as they now come into play on a daily basis? More and more nations. We've also learned that soon there will be a hike on further products as far as imports from India are concerned, that there is some sort of a tag that will be required which will state that this product is now facing a 50% tariff, so on and so forth. How exactly are the US consumers really reacting to what's happening globally?
Thank you, Devika. Always great to be back, and always lovely to hear Dr. Saturo, because he's amazing and very eloquent when he talks about the perspective. Really, I think as you nailed it, right? Ultimately, it is the consumer, which post-COVID has been under a lot of burden. And as you know, during the Biden administration, we had a lot of hue and cry. And we are hearing the same echo right now coming through people saying that, we really need to put an end to this, because there is a growing fatigue where people are questioning whether how well this is going. Is this really going to impact the US long-term, gains in terms of economic gains, or will this really result in, and many have been calling it, is this the Great Depression 2.0 in the making? And that Great Depression which really actually impact America. But really on a practical basis, you see an increase, you see a worry, you see a lot of anxiety, especially for the middle class. And I've been here 20 years and we have seen the costs go up, and all the promises which are made, you don't really see them, right? Because you ultimately, it's your pocket that is most impacted. And it's really, again, if you look at America, there's a huge diversity, right? So the people who really are not all that well off, they are extremely impacted. And I would say, some of the folks who were rejoicing the tariff and this is the ultimate solution are suddenly realizing the economics of what tariff means to a particular country and ultimately what it does to the consumer pocket. So you will see eventually, from my perspective, if this saga goes on. In my last interview with you people, all of you had said that, I see at some point, because there's a lot of amalgamation of geopolitics linked to trade, and of course there's also personal ego linked into this mix. It's not working out very, very well. So really, on to sum up and say that it is the everyday person who gets his or her bread or the milk or the products coming. And interestingly, as you must have seen, that some of the products which have been exempted, right? For example, pharmaceuticals, right? So you see that kind of pick and choose factor here. But I think what it's pushed India, I would say, to a very interesting, as I said, isn't this from a surprise, shock, disappointment phase to saying that we need to embrace the situation, and let's look at, as Dr. Saturo was saying, let's look at our traditional partners in Japan. As you know, I'm the Suzuki generation, back in Delhi. I still remember when the, Maruti Suzuki 800 came, and you just talked about the e-launch today, right? It's those are important pieces that many of the investors are looking at. And if you look at the conversation, which will probably is again ignited, is the regional comprehensive economic partnership conversation, which, as you know, in 2019, India has walked out from it. But Japan and Singapore, if I remember, kept that door open for India. And if India is going to look at the RECP, you are looking at by 2030 close to about 80 to 100 billion opportunity just in this part of the world. In Asia. So I think there are these other aspects that are coming through. But honestly, on a personal, professional, and on a daily basis, there is extreme worry, as you pointed out. The tags are coming back in, and I think there will be an increase in the inflation, and that, of course, will impact the economy. And I think it's really playing around. And of course, eventually, and somebody asked me to delete my post on LinkedIn. Eventually, I also said, is this accelerating the de-dollarization? And is this also accelerating the call for a global currency? Because there are many, many multiple factors at play, and the ramifications are very strong and serious. Yes, the most serious thing is that on one day you're calling Prime Minister Modi to the White House and saying that, best partnership ever. In 3 months, then you're saying, well, let's roll back. This is not happening. So I think this will have very serious consequences on the US market particularly. I think EU is, as you know, is working towards an FTA. We have in India the UK FTA. Of course, there are many bilateral trade agreements between India, Japan, Singapore, and many others, UAE. But I think the regional thing will come up, and of course, the upcoming meeting in China is something that everybody is watching very, very closely.
Right, absolutely. I also have with me Mr. Keith Vaz, who joins us. Mr. Vaz, in your perspective, how exactly should the world now brace itself as far as these tariffs are concerned, given that somewhere it also feels as though Donald Trump has ushered, or rather forced, an era where most countries will now prefer to have direct agreements with one another in order to really circumvent or rather offset the impact of tariffs by larger nations like the United States of America. So how exactly is the UK now bracing for the impact?
Well, let me take a different view to some of the other commentators, and that is to thank Donald Trump for what he's done, because he's reminded the world that there are other countries in the world apart from the United States. And this constant decision, change of plan, one day there are tariffs on Mexico, the next day they're on Canada, the third day they're on Vietnam, and then they're on India. Using politics in this extraordinary way has made countries decide, actually, the world of trade does not really go through Washington, D.C. It's something that we've got to do ourselves. India has got to have strong bilateral relations with all countries in the region. The Pacific Rim is where the future of the world economy lies. So from that point of view, I think he's done us all a favor. And we should use every opportunity to rebuild relationships and get things moving. Perhaps what we really need now is someone very courageous to call for a new Doha round. We need a discussion on the future of trade on this planet, one that involves all countries. I know we've got BRICS over there who are taking their own different line, but that does not include most of the world. Similarly, the G20 does not include most of the world. And to be honest, the G20 and the G7 are probably completely paralyzed, depending on the mood of the President of the United States. We do need some stability in the world economic order, not just for the markets, but for the people who rely very heavily on a stable economy. So let us then look to create, maybe hosted in New Delhi or in Mumbai, a proper trade negotiations, a proper world trade conference that allows the rest of the world to have its say. That is probably the best way of fostering relations between different countries, and I think that most countries would be delighted to take part.
Okay, I want to bring in Mr. Nagao on that thought then. Mr. Nagao, interesting perspective there put in by Mr. Vaz, that in a way the Trump administration's tariff strategy fundamentally is redefining the scope of national security and trade policy. Now, while that was the thought process of the Trump administration, what they've not realized, as Mr. Vaz was also pointing out, is that they've, in a way, pushed all other nations to think similarly. Your thoughts on the same?
My thought is indeed completely different. My character is always original. But in my analysis, the Trump administration's tariff policy came from the quite American culture and indeed their competition with China. Because I need to explain this one by one. Firstly, in the United States, when I stayed and I feel winning the competition is a very important factor to organize the people. For example, if we pick up the example as a president election, each state they choose state. This is one kind of the zero-sum game. Winner get everything. So that's why the system itself relies on the victory or not. So that's why, for example, the 51% one candidate get, and another candidate get 49%. In this case, what happened? 51 side gets all of the people to vote. So that's why this is quite American. Victory is very important. So in this case, view from the U.S. people, U.S. culture, in the world, economy should be developed. World economy should be developed. But most important thing is win the competition with rivals. So that's why in this case, when we check the history of the United States, last 200, about 50 years in this case, 49 exactly. But in this case, U.S. hasn't allowed any rival to survive, including Germany, Japan, Soviet Union, all rivals. Cannot survive because of the U.S. Focusing on the competition, and winning the competition is matter. View from this, China is rising, and China could be the number one if they continue to rise. This is very big threat view from the U.S. culture. So they cannot ignore the rise of China anyway. And view from this, when we check the Trump's tariff, there are three types of tariff we can understand. Firstly, of course, the tariff imposed on China is one thing. Even if the Trump say Canada, Mexico, and China, all of three fentanyl-related tariff is needed. In this case, why the Canada and Mexico is postponed and China only impose? Of course, currently, because the U.S. need to focusing on the Russia, Ukraine, or Middle East, without solve these issues, they cannot concentrate the resources against China in the Indo-Pacific. That's why this is one kind of the ceasefire has happened. But in the near future, Trump administration will be focusing on the tariff on China again, because they believe China will be the rival against the United States. And secondly, why the United States impose many tariffs on many countries at the same time? In this case, under the current global free trade rule, China will catch up the United States. So they need to change the rule itself. Originally, this global free trade rule itself has advertised from the United States because that time US believed this is a theory of the victory. But now they realize it. China will catch up. China get more benefits than the United States. So that's why they need to change the rule itself. In this case, they need to impose a tariff on all of the countries in the world. And thirdly, United States focusing on the military industry by using tariff. For example, why steel, why aluminum, why shipbuilding, why car? All of these are the manufacturing sector. Why? Because this is military industrial sector. So China is building 140 F-ships last decade. This is the same number of the Japan Navy or the Indian Navy. This is a very rapid pace military expansion. In this case, what should US do? US need to reorganize their military industry to produce weapons. So in this case, this tariff is related with this. So three type of tariff, all of the three type of tariff is related with China. Firstly, imposing directly to China. Secondly, changing the global free trade rule. This is related with China. And thirdly, promoting the defense industry, in this case related with China. China. So US still focusing on China. That is a long-term goal of the Trump administration tariff policy, I believe. So that's why the US is still focusing on China, I think. Well, anyway, this is this a proper answer? Maybe I forget the answer. I forget the question itself, sorry. Thank you.
Right, absolutely. Mr. Ravi Karkara, I want to bring you back into the conversation. So I want to understand from your perspective as well. How do you think India and other nations should now harness this opportunity which presents itself of ensuring that in the future we're not necessarily relying on any sort of trade policy or security that goes through, that strictly goes via the United States of America?
I really want to reiterate the point Honorable Keith was said. I think one thing which is really coming out of this churning, I would call, is getting the people to really come together. And if anything, I think the whole call on Nobel Peace Prize, I think India and China, for example, started speaking. And it's interesting, it's still very people are skeptical, but, I've been extremely skeptical always of India, China. But, I think where the point that you just raised, I think some of the conversations I had with some of the Europeans here, really to look at it and say, there's a lot of fatigue in Europe of too much US dependency. And it's also, as you remember, that in April, Ursula had gone up to India and said, let's have a speed up the FTA conversation. And as you recall, India's been on the other side, has been for the last 20 years saying that, we need to do an FTA with the EU. Now that whole process has got like 8 wheels to make it move forward. The same sentiment you see if you also look at strategically the way Prime Minister Modi went on the BRICS meeting. He stopped over in various countries, including in Africa and in Central America and the Caribbean, because very clearly, probably there was some kind of a sense that something's going crazy, which is not right. And I remember, I've said this in your channel that, when I asked this question to Honorable Jaishankarji here in New York, on 26th of June at the Times, at the Newsweek event, and I said, what is happening with FTA? And he said, Ravi, there's no FTA, there's a BTA, which is, business trade agreement. And of course, I've said it earlier, the alarm bells came very clearly. And I think what you're seeing is that the world is moving to really look at India's emergence as a very important opportunity, as Saturo pointed out, Dr. Saturo. And I think you see that I was in Dubai for some various meetings, the same sentiment. And I feel very strongly on the recommendation that was said earlier, that anybody who needs to convene, similar to G20, I think Prime Minister Modi should take on the opportunity to convene almost like a 2.0 of where the world's trade needs to be looked at. The point about the IMEC that Dr. Sapturo talked about, what is the relevance of IMEC in today's context? Where is the supply chain conversation? Where is the mutual agreement and dependence so that all countries grow with the opportunity and not just one-sided and one country deciding what the world needs to work on? And I think I would really say that, at least with quick rounds of Africa that I've done, Middle East I've done, Europe I've done in the recent time, including, some of my friends in Latin America and Panama saying, we need to really come up with India. And you see that. You didn't see that 10 years ago, right? You see countries saying that, we want to align with India. You saw that President Lula saying that, we want to have a conversation with India. So yes, on that point, I think this opportunity should not be let go to have a serious conversation on where the world trade is. Are the mechanisms and processes that are today, are they already functional in 2025, or they need to be rejigged and re-looked at? Similarly, I would say just not linking to finance, it also has to link to the financial systems and the whole dollar-based SWIFT system. For example, I think we're moving into a more digital world. I think, and India's UPI has shown anything to the world is that it can be done very easily. And last point I want to underline before I conclude is a very important point that Dr. Satura talked about is the arm production. And I think the irk really came through after Operation Sindhu, where I think instead of celebrating India's innovation with Akash Tir or BrahMos missile, it always became like a threat really to some of these countries, especially US, which has always led the market with about 47% control over the arm production and arm sales. So we of course have other actors in place. Of course, we have USA, we have Russia, we have China, we have some others in France. But India's entry on a self-made, extremely brilliant piece of technology with BrahMos, I think it really opened many eyes. And we saw that in the dissemination of the Turkish drone industry. Everybody's gone backtrack. You've seen F-35s. People are going backtrack on that. So you see that. That's where I really feel that when you mix the global trade with tariffs put in, and then you throw in a Pakistan and India rivalry into it, I think it's not going the way probably some of the folks planned it in the White House. And many of us who spent about 2 decades working on the India-U.S. partnership and agreement, we are very disappointed. We were very worried, but of course, I always think that in 3 months, as Honorable Keith was said, that in 3 months you might actually see Trump visiting India and saying all is well, all is great, let's move forward. But I think in the meantime, it is very clear that you cannot let the global economies work through this volatilities and fluctuations. It doesn't really impact, and it's ultimately the consumer in all sides who will be the most impacted. And I think the strong test of time will really tell you that India will stand strong out of this, especially with all the support you're seeing from all over the world. Really, it's coming really from all over the world. So that has been absolutely brilliant. Thank you, Devika.
Right, absolutely. Mr. Vaz, I want to leave the last word with you. I want to also understand from you, as far as India is concerned, our tariffs 50%, the highest along with Brazil. It consists of a 25% reciprocal tariff, but at the same time, an additional 25% for our continued oil trade with Russia. So clearly, as you've also pointed out, somewhere this new policy under the Trump administration is linking India's tariffs explicitly to our foreign policy decisions. What sort of a precedent is being set by the US president?
You're absolutely right. This is absolutely unbelievable that trade policy, that tariffs policy should be linked with who the Prime Minister of India meets and what are the imports that India is involved in having. This is totally unprecedented. I don't think that we could ever imagine that a free trade party like the Republican Party, which has now been captured by the MAGA libertarians, would actually want to do this. This goes against every single thing that the MAGA Republicans stand for, which is a free trade economy. They're talking about subsidies being given to American businesses to protect them against competition. And that is why I think the response of India has been so mature, so gracious in the way in which they've dealt with this. They haven't attacked America, they haven't criticized, they pointed out facts. Shortly after it went up to 50%, President of the United States was clapping the President of Russia as President Putin walked on the red carpet in Alaska, which is bizarre. Here we are being criticized, India being criticized for what it's doing with Russia, and the President himself of the United States greeting him in this way. I think this can only be dealt with, only be solved at a WTO level. The next conference is going to take place in Africa, in the Cameroon, in 2026. If it's not resolved by then, and another drama has not occurred, I think it has to be resolved there. The countries of the world, all of them, need to get together as part of the WTO process, taking on board what happened in Abu Dhabi in 2024, and make sure that they make progress in this. Because if they don't, I think that the fluctuations will destroy many jobs, and in the long run, I'm sorry to say, it'll damage severely the economy of the United States of America. I know he sets out to damage the Indian economy by saying it's very unfair, all these exports going in, but there is no investment that seems to be going into the economy in the United States which deals with the imports that the Indians have made. I've just come back from Atlanta and I've been talking to members of the Indian community there. I have to tell you, he is now very unpopular, President Trump, from being very popular indeed amongst the Indian community, moving them from the Democrats to the Republicans. I'm sorry to say that they are very unhappy with his stance on India, and there will be domestic political repercussions to what he is doing there, because the Indian population, a diaspora population in America, is strong and powerful, and they will not allow this to happen and continue to happen. So many consequences as a result of this decision. That is why I think the only place it can be dealt with is on a global level at a WTO conference, taking on board what happened in Abu Dhabi and Dubai and taking it forward in Cameroon in 2026.
Right, absolutely. On that note, I've completely run out of time, but I thank all of our guests for joining us on the broadcast to take that conversation forward. We leave it there.